Rain soaked the cemetery as a young maid collapsed beside a billionaire's grave, her hands buried in wet soil. Her sobs breaking the silence no money could buy. She cried like someone who had lost her only shelter in the world. Not an employer, not a master, but the one human being who had ever treated her like she mattered. Around her the flowers were expensive, the tombstone was perfect, yet the grief was real, raw, unpaid. What she didn't know was that the man beneath that grave was not truly gone, and somewhere nearby, unseen in the rain, someone was watching her cry. Before we enter this story, tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your country. And if stories about kindness, truth, and hidden destinies move your heart, don't forget to subscribe. Sarah Owusu had learned very early in life how to become invisible. In the Balogun mansion on the outskirts of Lagos, invisibility was not a metaphor. It was survival. You spoke only when spoken to. You lowered your eyes when the masters passed. You learned to walk softly, to breathe quietly, to exist without leaving a trace. Sarah did all of that well. She woke before dawn every day, long before the sun warmed the marble floors of the mansion. While the city was still half asleep, she scrubbed, washed, folded, and cleaned, moving from room to room like a shadow that served but was never seen. By the time the Balogun family emerged from their rooms, everything was already perfect, and Sarah was already tired. No one asked how she felt. No one ever did. Mrs. Felicia Balogun, the matriarch of the house in everything but name, liked to remind the staff of their place. Her voice carried through the corridors, sharp and commanding, cutting through the air like a whip. Sarah. Did I ask for dust on that table? Sarah, move faster. You're not doing charity work here. Sarah, don't just stand there like a fool. Sarah always answered the same way. Yes, Ma. I'm sorry, Ma. I'll fix it, Ma. She never argued, never explained, never defended herself, because explaining only made things worse. Kelvin Balogun. Thomas's cousin was different from Felicia in tone, but not in cruelty. He smiled more. He joked, but his jokes always landed like stones. So this is the famous quiet one, he once said, circling Sarah as she served tea. Does she speak at all, or is she broken? The others laughed. Sarah lowered her head and kept pouring. Only one person in that house did not laugh. Thomas Balogun watched everything. He was not a man who raised his voice. He did not insult. He didn't need to. His authority was quiet, heavy, and unquestioned. When Thomas entered a room, conversations shifted. People straightened. Smiles became careful. To the world. Thomas Balogun was a billionaire, real estate, logistics, ports, warehouses, power. His name appeared in newspapers beside words like visionary and empire. His face appeared on screens beside politicians and investors, but inside his own house, Thomas was mostly silent and observant. He noticed how Sarah flinched before Felicia spoke. He noticed how she waited until everyone had eaten before touching food herself. He noticed how she thanked security guards by name, even when they barely nodded back. One afternoon, something small happened, small enough that no one else would have remembered it. Felicia accused Sarah of breaking a porcelain vase, an antique imported from Europe, expensive enough to make anger feel justified. The vase had fallen when Kelvin brushed past the table too quickly, but blame did not follow truth in that house. You useless girl, Felicia snapped. Do you know how much that costs? Sarah knelt immediately, hands trembling. I'm sorry, Ma, I didn't. Don't lie to me, Felicia shouted. You think poverty gives you the right to destroy what you can't afford? Thomas had been walking down the stairs when he heard it. He stopped. The room fell silent as he stepped closer. She didn't break it, Thomas said calmly. Felicia turned, startled. Thomas, I saw what happened, he continued. His voice was even but final. Kelvin brushed the table. Kelvin opened his mouth, then closed it again. Felicia forced a smile. Well, accidents happen. Yes, Thomas said. They do. His eyes flicked briefly to Sarah. Stand up, he told her. Sarah obeyed, confused, heart pounding. Go finish your work, Thomas added. She bowed her head and left her legs shaking. That was all he said. No lecture, no punishment, no drama. But for Sarah, it was everything. That night she cried quietly into her pillow, not from pain, but from shock. No one had defended her before. Not once, not ever. She did not allow herself to imagine why. She only felt something unfamiliar and dangerous bloom in her chest. Hope. From that day on, Sarah watched Thomas the way one watches a distant star, aware of its light, but never believing it could be reached. She learned his habits, how he drank his coffee black, how he paused before entering meetings as if preparing himself for a battle no one else could see, how he sometimes stood by the window late at night, looking out at the city instead of at people. And Thomas continued to watch Sarah. He noticed how she worked even harder after that day, not out of obligation but gratitude. He noticed how she never mentioned the incident to anyone, how she carried dignity quietly without demanding recognition. One evening, as Sarah cleared plates after dinner, Thomas spoke again. "What's your name?" he asked. Sarah froze. She had worked in that house for 2 years. No one had ever asked her that. "Sarah, sir," she said softly. "Sarah Owusu." He nodded. "Where are you from?" "Ghana, sir. I came when my sister fell ill. I needed work." Thomas studied her for a moment, not unkindly. "Thank you for your work," he said simply. Then he walked away. It was nothing. And it was everything, because in a house where Sarah had been treated like furniture, someone had finally spoken to her like a human being. She did not know it then, but those small moments, those quiet observations were being stored carefully in Thomas Balogun's mind. Not as sentiment, as truth. Truth about loyalty, truth about character, truth about who people were when power believed itself unseen. And far away beyond Sarah's imagination, a reckoning was already taking shape. The morning Thomas Balogun did not come home, the mansion felt different. It was subtle at first, too quiet, too still, the kind of silence that presses against the ears instead of calming them. Sarah noticed it while polishing the long dining table, her hands moving slower than usual as she listened for footsteps that never came. Thomas was always precise. If he said he would return by 7, he returned by 7, not 7:30, not 8. Precision was his language. By 9 o'clock, Mrs. Felicia Balogun began pacing. "Call him again," she snapped at the house manager. "What kind of grown man switches off his phone?" Kelvin tried to sound relaxed, but his foot tapped against the marble floor. Maybe he stayed overnight in the city. Meetings run late, but no one truly believed that. At 10:30, the call came. Sarah was in the laundry room when she heard Felicia scream. Not a controlled shout, not a command, a scream. The sound tore through the mansion like glass shattering. Staff froze where they stood. Someone dropped a tray. Another began to pray under their breath. Sarah ran to the hallway, her heart pounding just in time to see Felicia sink into a chair, her phone slipping from her hand. "What happened, Ma?" the house manager asked, already pale. Felicia's lips trembled. "There's been an accident." The words felt unreal, floating in the air without meaning. "A serious one," she continued, struggling to breathe. "Thomas's car? The highway near the construction site. They say it exploded." The house spun. Sarah's knees gave way and she grabbed the wall to steady herself. Exploded. Someone asked questions. Someone else cried. Kelvin stared straight ahead, his face unreadable. Sarah heard none of it clearly. Her mind latched onto one image: Thomas standing by the window at night, staring at the city alive. Breathing, watching. She shook her head as if that could undo the words she had just heard. By noon, the news was everywhere. Billionaire businessman Thomas Balogun killed in tragic highway explosion. Powerful Nigerian tycoon dies at 47. Empire left without a king. Televisions blared in the living room. Phones rang endlessly. Security arrived. Lawyers followed. And still no one asked how Sarah felt. She moved through the chaos like a ghost, serving water, clearing glasses, listening to grief that felt rehearsed. Felicia cried loudly in front of visitors, pressing tissues dramatically to her eyes. "My nephew, my son," she sobbed. "He was everything to this family." Kelvin stood beside her, shaking his head solemnly. "This is a great loss, a great loss." Sarah watched from the doorway, her chest burning. She had seen Thomas's kindness when no one was watching. She had heard his silence speak louder than all this noise. And now, he was gone. That evening, Dr. Samuel Adebayo arrived. He spoke quietly with Felicia and Kelvin behind closed doors. His face was serious, professional, unreadable. The body was badly damaged, he said later, addressing the family. Identification was confirmed through personal effects. There will be a closed casket. Sarah's breath caught. Closed casket. It meant no goodbye, no last look, no proof her mind could cling to. That night, Sarah could not sleep. She sat on her narrow bed in the servants' quarters, staring at the wall, replaying every moment she had ever shared with Thomas Balogun. The way he had said her name, the way he had defended her without hesitation, the way he had thanked her. Her chest tightened painfully. She pressed her hand over her mouth to silence the sob that rose unexpectedly. "Thank you for your work." That was the last thing he had ever said to her. By morning, preparations for the funeral were underway. The mansion transformed quickly. Flowers arrived by the truckload. Chairs were arranged. Canopies erected. Everything was efficient, expensive, perfect, and completely empty. Sarah was assigned to assist during the ceremony. She was dressed in black like everyone else, but her grief felt different, heavier, unrecognized. As the funeral began, important guests filled the compound, politicians, business partners, men who had feared and respected Thomas Balogun in equal measure. Pastor Elijah Mensah spoke of legacy, of success, of impact. Thomas Balogun was a man of vision, the pastor said solemnly, a pillar of this nation. Sarah stood near the back, her hands clasped tightly together. They spoke of his wealth, his achievements, his name. No one spoke of his kindness. When the closed casket was lowered, Felicia wailed loudly, supported by two women. Kelvin bowed his head dramatically, his hand over his heart. Sarah did not cry, not then. It was only later, when the guests had left and the sun had begun to sink, that the weight finally crushed her. She waited until night fell, until the house was quiet again, until no one was watching. Then she slipped out. The cemetery was not far, but it felt like a lifetime away. The air was damp, the sky heavy, clouds gathered as if mourning too. Sarah stood before the grave marked with Thomas Balogun's name, her legs trembling. This time there was no crowd, no performance, no audience. She dropped to her knees. "I don't know why this hurts so much," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You barely knew me." Her tears fell freely now, soaking into the earth. "But you saw me, when no one else did." The rain began to fall softly, as if responding to her pain. "I hope you knew," she continued, pressing her palm to the ground. "I was grateful. Every day." Her shoulders shook as sobs overtook her. "I prayed for you. I still do." Behind the scenes of grief and rain, far from Sarah's reach or understanding, something else was happening. In a private medical facility miles away, machines hummed steadily. A man lay still, his face partially obscured, bandages wrapped carefully around his head and chest. His breathing was slow, controlled. Dr. Samuel Adebayo stood beside the bed, checking monitors. "He's stable," the doctor said quietly. "The world believes you're dead." The man's eyes opened, sharp, aware, alive. Thomas Balogun stared at the ceiling, listening to silence, to distance, to truth unfolding without him. "Good," he murmured. Outside, rain continued to fall, and at a grave marked with his name, the only person who cried for him without expectation knelt alone in the dark, unaware that the man she mourned was still breathing, still watching. By the third day after the funeral, grief in the Balogun mansion had begun to change its shape. It no longer wore black clothes and swollen eyes. It wore calculations. Sarah felt it in the air the moment she returned from the cemetery that night. The house was awake, lights on, voices low but urgent. Doors that had always been closed were suddenly opening. Papers appeared on tables where flowers had been just hours earlier. Thomas Balogun was barely in the ground, and the living were already moving on. Mrs. Felicia Balogun sat in the main living room, her back straight, her face dry. The dramatic sorrow she had displayed at the funeral was gone, replaced by something sharper, focused. "Kelvin," she said, tapping her manicured nails against the armrest, "you must speak to the lawyers again tomorrow." Kelvin nodded, leaning forward. "They said the will is clear, but there are areas we can interpret." Felicia's lips curved into a thin smile. "Everything is interpretable if you know where to look." Sarah stood near the doorway with a tray of tea, her hands steady but her heart uneasy. She wasn't meant to be listening, yet no one seemed to remember she existed. That was the cruel gift of being invisible. "Thomas trusted too easily," Felicia continued. "He left too much power in structures instead of people." Kelvin scoffed. "He won't be needing it now." The words made Sarah's chest tighten. "Won't be needing it now." She lowered the tray gently, careful not to make a sound, and stepped away before her emotions betrayed her presence. That night her room felt smaller than ever. Sarah lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the sound of Felicia's voice. Something felt wrong, not just morally, but deeply. Like a house whose foundation had cracked while everyone admired the paint. She whispered a prayer into the darkness, the same one she had whispered at the grave. "Protect what mattered to him. Morning brought orders. Felicia called the staff together, her tone clipped and efficient. "Things will change around here," she announced. "Until the estate is fully settled, expenses will be monitored closely." Sarah's stomach sank. "No unnecessary meals," Felicia continued. "No overtime, no wandering around the house without purpose." Her eyes landed on Sarah, and especially no sentimental nonsense. Sarah bowed her head. "Yes, Ma." By midday, the changes were visible. Security checkpoints tightened, certain rooms were locked, documents were moved. Conversations stopped abruptly when Sarah entered a room. She felt like a stranger in a house she had cleaned with her own hands. That afternoon, Sarah was called into the main hall. Felicia sat with Kelvin and two unfamiliar men in suits. Files lay open on the table. Felicia said coldly, "You were close to Thomas, were you not?" The question startled her. I worked here, Ma." Felicia tilted her head. "That wasn't the question." Sarah swallowed. "He spoke to me sometimes." Kelvin smirked. "Sometimes, yes, sir." Felicia leaned forward. "You were often in his study. Late evenings, cleaning?" "Yes, Ma." "And you never heard anything," Felicia pressed, "about his plans, his intentions, his will?" Sarah shook her head immediately. "No, Ma, never." Felicia studied her for a long moment as if searching for a crack. "Very well," she said finally. "You may go." As Sarah turned to leave, Felicia added sharply, "But remember, loyalty does not survive death. Be careful where you place yours." The words followed Sarah all the way back to the servants' quarters. That evening, something happened that changed everything. Sarah returned to her small room to find it in disarray. Her mattress had been lifted, her few belongings scattered, her breath caught in her throat. "What is this?" she whispered. Before she could gather herself, Kelvin appeared at the doorway, flanked by two guards. "Ah, there it is," Kelvin said lightly. He bent down and picked something up from the floor. A gold pen, Thomas's pen, the one he always kept in his jacket pocket. Sarah's heart dropped. I found that in the hallway," she said quickly. "I was going to return it." Kelvin's smile didn't reach his eyes. "So you admit you took it?" "No," Sarah protested. "I didn't steal anything." Felicia appeared behind him, her expression unreadable. "This pen is worth more than you earn in 5 years," she said calmly. "Why was it in your room?" Sarah's hands trembled. "I swear, Ma." "I didn't." Felicia raised her hand, silencing her. "Enough," she said. "I have tolerated too much sentiment already." She turned to the guards. "Escort her out." Sarah froze. "Ma, please, out," Felicia repeated. Sarah's world narrowed to a sharp, unbearable point. Chief Musa Abdullahi stood near the stairs watching silently. Their eyes met for a brief moment. Sarah saw conflict there, regret, but he did nothing. She was given 10 minutes to pack, 10 minutes to erase years. As Sarah stepped out of the mansion gates that night with a small bag in her hand, rain began to fall again, soft at first, then heavier. She looked back once. The house stood tall and bright, indifferent to her departure. Inside, plans continued. Miles away in a quiet medical room, Thomas Balogun listened to reports through a secure line. "Your aunt has begun restructuring the estate," Dr. Samuel Adebayo said carefully. "Kelvin is ambitious." Thomas closed his eyes. "And Sarah?" he asked quietly. There was a pause. "She was dismissed," the doctor said, "accused of theft." Thomas's jaw tightened. For the first time since waking, anger cut through his calm. Outside, rain soaked the city, and somewhere on a dark street, Sarah Owusu walked alone, carrying nothing but truth, dignity, and a loyalty that had cost her everything. Sarah did not know where to go. Lagos at night was a living creature, loud, restless, hungry. Headlights cut through the rain like knives. Street sellers pulled plastic sheets over their goods. People ran for shelter, but Sarah walked slowly, the weight of her small bag pressing into her shoulder like an accusation. She had been thrown out of the only place that had given her stability. Not kindness, not safety, but stability. Now even that was gone. She stopped under the weak cover of a kiosk awning, dripping wet, and tried to breathe. Her chest hurt in a way she could not explain, part humiliation, part grief, part disbelief. She whispered to herself, "It wasn't mine." The words vanished into the sound of rain. A bus drove past, splashing muddy water onto her skirt. Sarah flinched but didn't react. She barely felt it. What was wet clothes compared to the feeling of being erased? She thought of Naomi, her younger sister back in Ghana. Naomi's voice had always been soft, hopeful, the kind of voice that made Sarah want to keep living even when life felt like punishment. "Please, Sarah," Naomi had said years ago, coughing weakly, "don't let the world make you hard." Sarah swallowed, fighting tears. "I didn't," she whispered. "I'm trying." But tonight she felt something dangerous creeping into her heart. Not hatred, a quiet question. Why is goodness always punished first? She wandered until the city thinned, until the bright lights gave way to dim street lamps and empty roadside. Her shoes were soaked through, her fingers were numb, her stomach cramped with hunger, but she barely noticed, because there was only one place her body seemed to pull her toward: the cemetery. She didn't plan it, her feet simply remembered. When she arrived, the gates were half open and the guardhouse looked empty. The rain had slowed to a steady drizzle, heavy enough to keep the world blurred, light enough to let her breathe. Thomas Balogun's grave sat where it had the night before, fresh soil, dark and swollen flowers still bright against the gray. Sarah dropped to her knees again, as if her body knew no other posture in front of that name. The air smelled of wet earth and dying petals. She pressed her palm to the ground and cried, not loud, not for anyone to hear, the kind of crying that feels like something breaking quietly inside you. "I'm sorry," she whispered through tears. "I'm so sorry." She didn't even know what she was apologizing for: being poor, being powerless, being alive in a world that treated her like disposable dust. The tombstone stared back with cold certainty. Thomas Balogun, beloved son, leader, legacy. Sarah laughed once, small, bitter, wounded. "Beloved?" she said shakily. "They loved your money, sir. That's what they loved." Her tears fell again. "I don't even know why I'm here," she admitted, voice trembling. "I shouldn't be. I should be angry. I should hate them. I should," her throat tightened. "But I can't leave you like this. I can't pretend you were just another rich man." She leaned forward until her forehead touched the soil. "You were the only one who ever asked my name," she whispered. "The only one who ever said thank you." Her shoulders shook. "That day with the vase, I still remember. I was so embarrassed. I wanted to disappear. And you didn't even raise your voice. You just told the truth, like I mattered." The rain drummed softly on the leaves above her. Sarah's voice lowered, becoming intimate, as if she truly believed he could hear. "I never said it because it wasn't my place," she continued. "But I prayed for you, sir. I prayed that God would protect you from the people around you." She swallowed hard. "And now you're gone and I'm outside like an animal." A sob broke loose. "They accused me of stealing your pen," she said, shaking her head. "Your pen? As if I would take something that belonged to you. As if I would stain your memory with that." Her hands clenched in the mud. "I didn't take it. I swear I didn't." She looked up at the tombstone, eyes, swollen face wet. "I don't know if anyone loved you for real," she said, voice cracking. "But I did. Not like they do. Not for your money. Not for your name." Her breathing shook. "I loved you because you were human when you didn't have to be." Silence followed her confession. A long, heavy silence, and then Sarah whispered something else, softer, almost ashamed. "I don't even know if a maid is allowed to love a man like you." She wiped her face with trembling hands. "But I couldn't stop it. I couldn't stop my heart from feeling safe when you were near." She stared down at the ground again, ashamed of how exposed she had become. "Now I have nothing," she said, "and it's stupid, but losing the job didn't hurt as much as losing you." She pressed her fingers into the earth as if she could reach him. "If you were here," she whispered, "you would know I didn't steal. You would have looked at me and seen the truth." Her voice turned angry for the first time, not at Felicia, not at Kelvin, but at fate itself. "Why did you die, sir?" she demanded quietly. "Why did God take the one person who... Her throat collapsed into sobs again. She didn't notice the movement at first. A car had stopped outside the cemetery gate. Its headlights remained off. A figure stood beneath an umbrella, watching from a distance. Sarah didn't see him. She was too deep in grief. But the figure saw everything. The way she held the soil like it might dissolve. The way her tears fell without performance. The way her voice broke on the word safe. Inside that umbrella, the man's face was partially hidden by shadow, but his eyes were unmistakable. Thomas Balogun. alive, watching. His heart pounded in a way it hadn't since the day of the staged accident. It wasn't fear. It wasn't pain. It was the sudden sharp shock of truth, because he had expected many things. He had expected crocodile tears. He had expected fake prayers. He had expected bitterness from those he had protected. But he had not expected this. A maid kneeling in the rain confessing love to a grave she thought held his body. No cameras, no audience, only raw devotion. Thomas's fingers tightened around the handle of the umbrella. Beside him, Dr. Samuel Adebayo whispered, "We should leave. It's not safe for you to be here." Thomas didn't move. His eyes remained fixed on Sarah. "She's the only one." Thomas murmured, voice tight, "The only one crying like this." The doctor hesitated. "Sir." Thomas swallowed the emotion rising unexpectedly in his throat. He had built an empire. He had commanded rooms full of powerful men. But this small woman in the rain was undoing him. Sarah's shoulders shook again as she whispered her final words to the grave. "If heaven is real," she said softly, "then rest, sir. Rest with peace. And forgive me for loving you too late." Thomas's chest tightened. He took a step forward, just one, then stopped. Because if she saw him now, everything would shatter too soon. The plan, the evidence, the reckoning he was preparing. And yet, he couldn't ignore what he had just witnessed. He turned slightly, voice low, controlled, dangerous. "Felicia will pay for this," he said. "Kelvin too." Dr. Samuel swallowed. "What do you want to do about Sarah?" Thomas looked at the woman still kneeling, still crying, still unaware. "Find out where she sleeps tonight," Thomas said quietly. "She shouldn't be on the streets." The rain continued to fall, and Sarah Owusu, believing she was alone, held on to the only thing she had left, her truth. Sarah didn't know she was being watched. After the rain eased into a thin mist, she rose slowly from the ground, her knees aching, her clothes heavy with water and grief. She bowed her head once more to the grave, whispering a final prayer, then turned away. The night swallowed her footsteps as she walked back through the cemetery gates, unaware that her life had already begun to change direction. She slept that night in a cramped shelter near the bus station, curled on a thin mat among strangers. The air smelled of sweat and damp concrete. Every sound startled her awake. Yet even in exhaustion, her dreams were filled with Thomas's calm voice, asking her name, thanking her for her work. She woke before dawn with tears drying on her cheeks. Across the city, in a discreet private facility hidden behind high walls and unmarked gates, Thomas Balogun sat upright in bed, his body still healing, his mind painfully alert. Dr. Samuel Adebayo stood by the window, arms crossed. "You shouldn't be out there," he said again, quieter now. "Not yet. Your ribs are still fragile." Thomas nodded, but did not look away from the darkness beyond the glass. "I know." Silence stretched between them. "What you saw tonight," the doctor continued carefully, "wasn't part of the plan." Thomas finally turned his head. "No," he said, "it wasn't." He closed his eyes, replaying the image. He could not erase the way Sarah had knelt in the rain, the way her hands had dug into the soil, as if the earth itself might answer her pain. The sound of her voice stripped of all caution. "I built this plan to expose greed," Thomas said slowly, "to separate loyalty from performance." He opened his eyes again, sharper now. "But I didn't expect to find love buried in it." Dr. Adebayo said nothing. "You think I'm a fool?" Thomas went on. "A rich man moved by a poor girl's tears?" "No," the doctor replied honestly. "I think you finally saw something real." Thomas exhaled a short, controlled breath. She was thrown out like trash. Yes, for a lie. Yes. Thomas's hand clenched into a fist. Pain shot through his ribs, but he welcomed it. It grounded him. "They crossed a line," he said quietly. Dr. Adebayo nodded. "Then we proceed carefully. Emotion cannot rush this." Thomas met his eyes. Emotion didn't rush it. It revealed it. Later that morning, Chief Musa Abdullahi received a call on a secure line. The voice on the other end was calm, unmistakable. Sir Musa said, straightening instantly. "I want to report," Thomas said, "not on the estate, on Sarah Owusu." Musa hesitated. "She was dismissed late last night. I tried to intervene." "I know," Thomas said. "Where is she now?" Musa gave the location of the shelter. There was a pause. She didn't steal, Musa added quietly. I would stake my name on it. Thomas's voice softened slightly. I believe you. When the call ended, Musa sat down heavily, his heart racing. For the first time since the funeral, hope flickered. Meanwhile, back at the mansion, Felicia Balogun stood in Thomas's study, running her fingers across the polished desk. It's done, Kelvin said, leaning against the doorframe. The girl is gone. Felicia nodded. Good. She knew too much. She knew nothing, Kelvin scoffed. Felicia turned sharply. Which is exactly why she was dangerous. Kelvin raised an eyebrow. You think Thomas trusted a maid with secrets? Felicia's gaze hardened. Thomas trusted people based on character. That was his weakness. She picked up a folder and flipped through its contents. And people like her are loyal in inconvenient ways. Kelvin laughed lightly. She's irrelevant. Felicia closed the folder with a decisive snap. No one is irrelevant, only removed. They didn't know that every move they were making was being quietly documented. That every phone call, every signature, every transfer was adding weight to a case that would one day crush them. That afternoon, Sarah stood in line at a roadside cafe clutching the last of her money. She ordered the cheapest meal and ate slowly, savoring each bite as if it might be her last for a while. Hunger had taught her patience. As she stepped back onto the street, a black car pulled up beside her. The window rolled down halfway. Sarah froze. A man in plain clothes leaned slightly toward her. Miss Owusu. Her heart jumped. Yes, I'm with a private security firm, he said calmly. We've been asked to ensure you're safe. Her instinct screamed danger. By who? He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. By someone who owes you the truth. Sarah shook her head, backing away. I don't want trouble. The man lifted his hands gently. You're not in trouble, and no one will force you. But please, someone is worried about you. Worried. The word felt foreign. Sarah studied his face. He didn't look like the men who had accused her. He looked respectful. Where would you take me? She asked quietly. To a place where you can rest, he replied, and where your name is clean. Her throat tightened. My name was never dirty, I know, he said simply. After a long moment, Sarah nodded once. The car drove through streets she did not recognize, then through gates that opened silently. The house they arrived at was modest compared to the Balogun mansion, but it was warm, quiet, safe. Inside, Sarah was given dry clothes, food, and a room with a real bed. No questions, no accusations. As she sat on the edge of the bed, overwhelmed, she whispered, "Thank you. You're welcome," the man said. "Someone will speak with you soon." When he left, Sarah lay back and stared at the ceiling, her heart pounding. She didn't understand what was happening, but for the first time since being dismissed, she felt protected. That night, Thomas Balogun stood before a mirror, examining the faint scars that would soon fade. He adjusted his posture, testing his strength. Not yet, Dr. Adebayo cautioned. Another week. Thomas nodded. I can wait. He thought of Sarah sleeping in a clean bed, unaware of how close she was to the storm gathering around her. This changes nothing, Thomas said quietly, and everything. He sat down at the desk and began to write. Names, dates, decisions. This is no longer just about exposing greed, he murmured. It's about restoring justice. Outside, the city moved on, ignorant of the reckoning forming beneath its noise. And Sarah Owusu, finally asleep without fear, dreamed of a grave that no longer felt so final. Morning arrived quietly at the safe house, but inside Sarah Owusu nothing felt calm. She woke up slowly, confused by the softness beneath her body. For a brief second she thought she was still dreaming, until she remembered the rain, the cemetery, the black car, and the unfamiliar kindness that had followed her darkest night. She sat up, her heart racing. The room was simple but clean. Pale curtains filtered warm sunlight. A small table stood by the window with a glass of water and neatly folded clothes. No locks on the door, no guards watching her. For someone who had lived under constant supervision, the freedom felt unsettling. She whispered, "Where am I?" A gentle knock came at the door. Sarah, a woman's voice, asked softly, "Breakfast is ready." Sarah hesitated, then stood. She opened the door to find a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a calm smile. "My name is Aisha," the woman said. "You're safe here." Safe. The words settled slowly like dust after a storm. At the dining table, Sarah ate quietly. No one rushed her. No one corrected how she held her spoon. No one barked orders. The kindness felt almost painful, like touching a bruise. Who brought me here? Sarah finally asked. Isha paused. Someone who knows the truth about you. Sarah's fingers tightened around her cup. I didn't steal anything. I know, Isha replied gently. Everyone here does. Tears burned behind Sarah's eyes, but she forced them back. She was tired of crying. While Sarah tried to understand her new reality, the Balogun mansion was transforming into something unrecognizable. Felicia Balogun stood at the head of the long table document spread before her like a battlefield map. Her posture was rigid, her expression sharp. Effective immediately, she announced all discretionary spending is frozen. Staff contracts will be reviewed. Kelvin nodded eagerly. We should also consider selling off some overseas assets. Liquidity first. Felicia glanced at him. Careful, we don't want to appear desperate, Kelvin smirked. Just prepared. Around them, lawyers and advisors murmured approval. Plans layered over plans. Numbers replaced names. Thomas Balogun had become a memory and a resource. No one spoke of grief anymore. Later that day, Felicia dismissed the remaining household staff, cutting the team in half. Efficiency, she called it. Fear spread quietly among those left behind. Chief Musa Abdullahi watched everything in silence. His loyalty to Thomas had not faded, but it had become dangerous. That evening, as he patrolled the outer grounds, his phone vibrated. A single message. Continue observing. Do not intervene yet. Musa exhaled slowly. Yes, sir, he murmured. Across the city, Thomas Balogun watched security footage on a tablet, his jaw set. He had access to everything, now emails, bank records, hidden cameras. Felicia didn't know existed. She's moving too fast, Doctor. Samuel Adebayo said from behind him. She thinks speed equals control, Thomas replied. It doesn't. He paused the footage on an image of Kelvin laughing during a meeting. Greed always reveals itself, Thomas said quietly. You just have to let it speak. That night, Sarah sat on the edge of the bed staring at her hands. A knock came again, this time firmer. A man entered the room, tall, composed, dressed simply. Good evening, Sarah Owusu, he said. My name is Daniel. Something about him made her straighten instinctively. I'm here to ask you a few questions, he continued, and I want you to know there are no wrong answers. Sarah nodded cautiously. Did Thomas Balogun ever give you anything? Daniel asked. She shook her head. No, he didn't even give orders much. He just noticed things. Did he ever ask you to keep secrets? No. Daniel studied her carefully. Why do you think he defended you that day with the vase? Sarah thought for a moment. Because the truth mattered to him. Daniel's lips curved slightly. Yes, it did. He closed his notebook. One last question, he said gently. If Thomas Balogun were alive, what would you want to say to him? The room felt suddenly smaller. Sarah's voice trembled. I would tell him thank you, and I would tell him I didn't need his money. I just needed to know I wasn't invisible. Daniel nodded once. That's all he said. You'll be safe here. Someone will contact you soon. After he left, Sarah pressed her hand to her chest, trying to calm her breathing. Alive. The word echoed in her mind. She shook her head. No, that was impossible. Meanwhile, at the mansion, Felicia stood alone in Thomas's study late at night. She opened a locked drawer using a key she had found hidden behind a frame. Inside were folders labeled with dates. She frowned, flipping through them. Why would he keep all this? She muttered. She didn't realize the files were copies bait. The originals were already in Thomas's possession. Far away, Thomas watched the live feed as Felicia rifled through the drawer. Careful, he murmured. You're stepping exactly where I want you. Dr. Adebayo glanced at him, and Sarah Thomas's gaze softened briefly. She stays protected, no matter what. That same night, Sarah dreamed again. This time, Thomas wasn't silent. He stood under a tree looking at her with that same calm expression and said her name clearly. Sarah. She woke with her heart pounding. Outside her window, dawn crept in slowly, bringing with it the quiet certainty that the truth, no matter how buried, was already rising. The accusation did not end the night Sarah Owusu was forced out of the Balogun mansion. It followed her. By morning, it had a voice. Felicia Balogun ensured it did. News traveled quietly at first through phone calls, whispers among staff, carefully chosen words passed to people who knew how to repeat them louder. By the time Sarah finished breakfast at the safe house, her name had already begun to change shape in the mouths of others. She stole from the late Mr. Balogun. Imagine. After everything. These poor ones are always the same. Sarah didn't know any of this yet. She sat in the small living room staring at a television she hadn't turned on. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap, her mind restless. The calm around her felt temporary, like borrowed time. When the knock came, she flinched. This time it wasn't gentle. Aisha opened the door, her expression tightening as she stepped aside. Two men entered. One wore a neatly pressed uniform. The other carried a folder. Sarah Owusu, the uniformed man, asked, "Yes?" Sarah answered, her voice steady despite the fear tightening her chest. "I'm Officer Tunde Akinwale," he said. "We need to ask you a few questions regarding a complaint filed against you." Aisha's eyes widened. "She's done nothing wrong." "That will be determined," the officer replied politely. Sarah stood. "What complaint?" The man with the folder opened it and slid out a photograph. Thomas's gold pen. Her heart sank. "You are accused of stealing property belonging to the late Thomas Balogun, officer," Akinwale said evenly. "A witness claims the item was found among your belongings." Sarah shook her head slowly. "That's not true." "You're denying possession?" the officer asked. "I'm denying theft," she said. "I didn't take it. Someone planted it." The second man scribbled notes. "Mrs. Felicia Balogun has requested formal questioning." The officer continued. "You'll need to come with us." Sarah looked to Aisha, fear flickering for the first time. "Please, I didn't do this." Aisha hesitated, then stepped forward. "She will cooperate, but she is not a criminal." Officer Akinwale nodded. "Then, this will be resolved quickly." As Sarah was escorted outside, a black vehicle waited at the curb. For a brief moment, the memory of another black car, the one that had brought her safety, flashed through her mind. This one felt different. At the station, the air was thick with heat and impatience. Sarah was seated on a hard bench while officers moved in and out, glancing at her with varying degrees of curiosity and judgment. One whispered to another, not quietly enough. Another housegirl thinking she can touch what doesn't belong to her. Sarah closed her eyes. She reminded herself of the truth. Truth was all she had. Hours passed. Finally, Officer Akinwale returned, his expression unreadable. "We've contacted the Balogun estate," he said. "They're pressing for charges." Sarah's breath caught. "On what evidence?" the pen, he replied. "And testimony." "Whose testimony?" she asked. He hesitated. "Mr. Kelvin Balogun." The name landed like a slap. "He lied," Sarah said firmly. "He knows he lied." Officer Akinwale studied her. "Do you have anyone who can vouch for you?" Sarah thought of the mansion staff, their fearful eyes, their silence. "No," she said softly. At that exact moment, in a private office miles away, Thomas Balogun watched the interrogation through a secure feed. His jaw tightened. "Enough," he said. Dr. Samuel Adebayo glanced at him. "It's time." "Not to reveal myself," Thomas replied, "but to intervene." He picked up his phone and dialed a number. "Proceed," he said simply. Back at the station, Officer Akinwale's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, then at Sarah. "Excuse me," he said, stepping aside. Minutes later, he returned. His demeanor changed. "Miss Owusu," he said carefully, "you're free to go." Sarah blinked. "What?" "The complaint has been withdrawn," he continued. "Effective immediately." Her heart pounded. "By who?" He paused. "By the estate's legal representative." Sarah stood slowly, disbelief washing over her. Outside, sunlight felt blinding. Aisha was waiting. She wrapped Sarah in a tight embrace the moment she saw her. "You're safe," she whispered. "I told you." Sarah's legs trembled. "Someone is protecting me," she murmured. "I don't know who, but someone is." That evening, Felicia Balogun slammed her phone onto the table. "Who withdrew the complaint?" she demanded. Kelvin frowned. "I don't know. The lawyer said it came from within the estate." Felicia's eyes narrowed. "That's impossible. I control the estate." Kelvin shifted uncomfortably. "Maybe Thomas left more safeguards than we thought." Felicia's voice dropped dangerously low. "Thomas is dead." Kelvin didn't answer. In a quiet room, Thomas Balogun removed the bandage from his hand, flexing his fingers. "She's stronger than I expected," Dr. Adebayo said. "She shouldn't have to be," Thomas replied. He stared at the screen showing Sarah stepping back into the safe house, her face pale but unbroken. "They tried to crush her with shame," he said, "and failed." Dr. Adebayo crossed his arms. "What now?" Thomas's eyes hardened. "Now they expose themselves further, and she stays protected." That night, Sarah sat alone in her room, staring at the wall. Someone had stepped in, someone powerful enough to stop the accusation with a single call. Her thoughts circled one impossible idea and pushed it away again. "No," she whispered. "He's gone." But somewhere deep inside, a fragile thread of doubt remained, and far above the city in silence and shadow, the man the world believed dead prepared the next move. Life after the police station felt unreal to Sarah Owusu, like she had stepped into a quiet pocket of time the rest of the world could not see. Days passed at the safe house without incident. No shouting, no accusations, no sudden orders barked from across a room. She woke when her body was ready. She ate without rushing. She slept without listening for footsteps in the hallway. And yet peace did not come easily, because safety, when you are not used to it, feels suspicious. Sarah spent long hours sitting by the window watching the street below. Children walked home from school. Vendors argued playfully over prices. Life went on careless and loud, as if nothing inside her had been shaken loose. But inside, her thoughts never rested. Someone had intervened, someone powerful, someone who knew her name. She replayed the moment at the police station over and over in her mind, the officer's sudden change in tone, the way the accusation vanished without explanation. That kind of power did not come from kindness alone. It came from influence. At night, memories crept in. She dreamed of the mansion, not as it was at the end, cold and hostile, but as it had been in quieter moments. The echo of her footsteps in the halls, the smell of polish and soap. Thomas Balogun standing by the window looking out at the city as if searching for something he could not name. In her dreams, he turned to her and spoke. But she never heard the words. She woke each time with her heart pounding her chest, aching with something dangerously close to hope. Across the city, reality was unraveling inside the Balogun estate. Felicia Balogun sat with her lawyer's irritation sharp in her voice. "I want to know who authorized the withdrawal of that complaint." One of the lawyers adjusted his glasses. It came from a controlling interest tied to Mr. Balogun's private directives. Felicia stiffened. "That's not possible." "Thomas, never." "He did," the lawyer interrupted carefully. "There are safeguards, automated permissions, triggers." Kelvin shifted in his seat. "Triggers for what?" The lawyer hesitated. "For misconduct. For deviations from certain ethical boundaries." Felicia's face hardened. "Are you telling me my nephew designed a system to monitor his own family?" The lawyer did not answer directly. "I'm telling you," he said slowly, "that Thomas Balogun was not a man who trusted easily." Kelvin forced a laugh. "He's dead." The lawyer's eyes flicked to him. "Yes, but his systems are very much alive." That night, Felicia stood alone in the study, surrounded by the quiet hum of the house. She poured herself a drink she barely tasted. Something was wrong. Not in the way of ghosts or superstition, but in the way of control slipping through her fingers. And Felicia Balogun hated nothing more than losing control. Meanwhile, Sarah received her first unexpected visitor. Daniel, the man who had interviewed her days earlier, returned in the early afternoon. He carried a folder this time, his expression thoughtful. "How are you feeling?" he asked. Sarah shrugged lightly. "Grateful, confused." "That's understandable," he said, taking a seat across from her. "I'd like to talk to you about your future." Her pulse quickened. "I don't want trouble." Daniel smiled faintly. "Neither do we." He slid the folder toward her. Inside was an offer. Not charity, not compensation, work. A position at a small logistics firm, administrative support, training provided, fair pay, housing assistance included. Sarah stared at the paper, her hands trembling. "Why?" she asked quietly. "Why help me like this?" Daniel met her gaze. "Because you were wronged, and because someone believes you deserve more than survival." She swallowed. "Who?" Daniel paused, then answered honestly. "I can't tell you that. Not yet." Sarah nodded slowly. She had learned not to push. "I'll work hard," she said. "I always do." "I know," Daniel replied. After he left, Sarah sat alone with the folder in her lap. For the first time since she arrived in Lagos, the future did not feel like a wall. It felt like a door slightly open. Elsewhere, Thomas Balogun listened to the report in silence. She accepted the job offer, Dr. Adebayo said. "No questions, no demands." Thomas nodded. "Good. You could have done more," the doctor added. "Given her money, security, comfort." Thomas shook his head. "That would have cheapened everything." He leaned back slowly, careful of his healing body. She doesn't need saving, he continued. She needs dignity. Dr. Adebayo studied him. And what do you need? Thomas didn't answer immediately. He thought of the rain, the grave, the way Sarah's voice had broken when she said she felt safe around him. I need the truth to finish what it started, Thomas said finally. Over the next week, Sarah began her new job. She arrived early, took notes, asked questions, made mistakes and corrected them without complaint. Her supervisors noticed. She's quiet, one said, but she listens. Each evening, Sarah returned to the safe house exhausted, but proud. It felt good to earn something again, not because she was desperate, but because she was capable. Yet even as her life slowly stabilized, the past refused to release her completely. One evening, while sorting old belongings in her small room, Sarah found something she had forgotten she kept, a folded piece of paper. She opened it carefully. It was a receipt, old faded from the day Thomas had defended her over the broken vase. She had picked it up from the floor afterward without knowing why. A meaningless thing, or so she thought. She stared at it now, her chest tightening. Why had she kept it? Why did his memory still follow her so closely? She pressed the paper flat and whispered, Please, let me move on. But fate was not finished with her. Back at the Balogun estate, Kelvin made a mistake. A small one. He signed a transfer too quickly, assuming no one was watching. The alert triggered immediately. Miles away, Thomas Balogun's screen lit up. There it is, he murmured. Dr. Adebayo leaned closer. That's enough to move forward. Thomas's expression was calm, but his eyes were sharp. Yes, he said. It's time. He closed the file and stood carefully testing his balance. Their world is about to change, he added quietly, unaware that the man she mourned was preparing to return. Sarah Owusu lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the city. For the first time in weeks, she whispered something new. Thank you, whoever you are. She had no idea that the answer to her prayer was closer than she imagined. The mistake Kelvin Balogun made was small enough to feel harmless. A signature placed too quickly, a transfer approved without double-checking. A moment of confidence born from believing the man who designed the system was dead. But Thomas Balogun had built his empire on understanding one simple truth. People reveal themselves when they believe no one is watching. At dawn, Thomas sat in a secured room, the soft hum of servers filling the silence. His face was calmer than it had been in weeks, the sharp edge of restraint finally giving way to purpose. Dr. Samuel Adebayo stood beside him, tablet in hand. The transfer confirms intent, offshore routing, false authorization codes. Thomas nodded. Kelvin was never patient, and Felicia the doctor asked. Thomas tapped the screen. She's smarter, but greed makes even smart people predictable. On the screen, a timeline unfolded, emails, calls, approvals, delays. Each action neatly layered, each motive exposed by its own urgency. She didn't just take advantage of my absence, Thomas said quietly. She prepared for it. He closed his eyes briefly, recalling his aunt's voice, the way she had spoken of loyalty as something temporary. Then let her live with that belief a little longer, he continued. The deeper they go, the harder the fall. Across the city, Sarah Owusu walked into her new office building carrying a simple lunch bag and a notebook. She wore plain clothes, her hair pulled back neatly. No one there knew her past. No one asked. She liked that. Her supervisor, a woman named Mrs. Dyke, noticed Sarah's diligence immediately. You're early every day, Mrs. Dyke remarked during a break. Sarah smiled softly. I don't like being late. Mrs. Dyke studied her. You've worked in houses before. Yes, Ma, it shows, she said. But here you don't need to disappear. You're allowed to exist. The words hit Sarah harder than she expected. She nodded, unable to speak for a moment. That evening, as Sarah returned to the safe house, she noticed something different. A subtle change in the air, a sense of anticipation she couldn't explain. Aisha met her at the door, smiling. You have a visitor. Sarah's heart jumped. Who? A friend, Aisha replied gently. In the sitting room, Daniel stood waiting. His expression was serious but not unkind. I won't stay long, he said. I just wanted to see how you're settling in. I'm grateful, Sarah replied honestly. For everything. He nodded. Good. There was a pause. Sarah, he said carefully, have you told anyone about the cemetery? About what you said at the grave? Her breath caught. No. Why would I? Daniel studied her face. No reason. I just needed to know. After he left, Sarah sat alone, unsettled. How could he know about the cemetery? She pushed the thought away. There were things she couldn't explain. She was learning to live with that. Back at the Balogun estate, tension thickened like smoke. Felicia paced the living room, phone pressed to her ear. "I want those documents finalized today," she snapped. "No delays." Kelvin lounged nearby, feigning calm. "Relax. Everything is under control." Felicia stopped abruptly. "Nothing is under control. The complaint against the girl was withdrawn without my approval." Kelvin rolled his eyes. "You're still worried about that maid," Felicia turned on him. "That maid knew Thomas. She mattered to him." Kelvin scoffed. "You're giving her too much importance." Felicia stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Thomas never corrected people publicly unless he cared. That should have told you something." Kelvin opened his mouth to argue, then stopped, because for the first time, doubt flickered across his face. That same night, Thomas met with his legal team in a private location. "You're certain?" one of the attorneys asked. "Once you reveal yourself, there's no turning back." Thomas's gaze was steady. "I'm not revealing myself yet." The lawyers exchanged looks. "I want the board meeting scheduled." Thomas continued. "Emergency. Mandatory attendance. But they believe you're dead." Thomas finished. "Yes, which makes it more interesting." He slid a file across the table. "By the time they walk into that room," he said, "they'll already be exposed. I just need them to speak." The attorney nodded slowly. "And Sarah Owusu?" Thomas didn't hesitate. "She stays out of it. This is not her battle, but she's central to the motive," the lawyer pointed out, "the theft accusation." Thomas's eyes hardened. "She is not evidence. She is not leverage. She is a human being." Silence followed. "Understood." Meanwhile, Sarah sat on her bed that night, writing in a small notebook she had bought with her first paycheck. It was something she had never done before. She wrote about her sister Naomi, about the smell of rain on soil, about how strange it felt to be treated with respect. And then, without meaning to, she wrote his name. Thomas. She stared at it, her pen hovering. "I miss you," she whispered, embarrassed, even though no one could hear her. "I don't know why." She closed the notebook quickly, as if afraid of her own honesty. Elsewhere, Thomas Balogun stood before a mirror again, his suit now fitting comfortably over his healing body. He tested his voice low and calm. "Good evening," he said softly. "Thank you all for coming." He paused, imagining the room, the shock, the silence, the fear. A faint smile touched his lips. "They won't be ready," Dr. Adebayo said. "No," Thomas replied. "They never are." The next morning, invitations went out. Emergency board meeting, mandatory attendance regarding the Balogun estate. Felicia read the message twice, her pulse quickening. "Who authorized this?" she demanded. Kelvin frowned. "I didn't." Fear crept in quietly, threading itself through the arrogance they had worn like armor. Something was moving, and they could feel it. At her desk that same morning, Sarah looked up from her computer as an unfamiliar unease settled in her chest. She placed a hand over her heart, confused. She didn't know why. She only knew that something long delayed was finally approaching. The boardroom at Balogun Holdings had never felt so tense. Long before the meeting was scheduled to begin, executives and directors arrived in uneasy clusters, whispering behind careful smiles. The walls, polished wood, and framed photographs of ports towers and ribbon cuttings seemed to watch them. Thomas Balogun's face appeared in several of those frames, frozen in confident moments, from a past that now felt dangerously present. Felicia Balogun entered last. She wore black not for mourning anymore, but for authority. Her steps were deliberate, her chin lifted. She took her seat at the head of the table as if it had always belonged to her. Kelvin slid into a chair beside her, leaning back, trying to look relaxed. His fingers betrayed him, tapping against the armrest. "This is ridiculous," he murmured. An emergency meeting with no agenda. Felicia didn't answer. She was reading the room, counting faces, measuring loyalties. The door closed. Silence fell like a held breath. At exactly 9 o'clock, the screen at the front of the room flickered to life. A man's voice filled the space, calm, unmistakable, and very much alive. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen." Every head snapped toward the screen. Felicia's hand froze mid-adjustment of her glasses. Kelvin's smile vanished. The face that appeared was not Thomas, at least not yet. It was Daniel, standing in a dimly lit office. "I appreciate you all attending on such short notice," Daniel continued. What you are about to see is a review of estate activities conducted since the passing of Mr. Thomas Balogun. A murmur rippled through the room. Felicia leaned forward. Who authorized this presentation? Daniel's gaze flicked to the camera. Mr. Balogun did. The words landed heavy. Kelvin scoffed loudly. That's impossible. Daniel didn't react. He pressed a button. The screen split into timelines. Transactions, signatures, approvals. Numbers scrolled. Dates highlighted themselves. As acting representatives of the estate, Daniel said evenly, certain individuals were granted temporary authority. That authority came with conditions. The screen zoomed in on a transfer. Kelvin's transfer. His name glowed red. Kelvin straightened. That was a routine adjustment. Daniel nodded, routed through an offshore account not disclosed in Mr. Balogun's directives. The room stirred again. Felicia's jaw tightened. You're making accusations without context. Context is exactly what we're providing, Daniel replied. Another click. Emails appeared, Felicia's this time, carefully worded, calculated, instructing lawyers to reinterpret clauses, to delay audits, to prioritize certain sales. Felicia stood. This is outrageous. You have no right. You do, a voice interrupted. Not from the screen, from the door. The room turned slowly as if afraid of what it might see. Thomas Balogun stood there, alive, whole, watching them. The air seemed to collapse inward. Someone gasped. A chair scraped loudly against the floor. A glass tipped over and shattered the sound, sharp and small against the enormity of the moment. Felicia staggered back into her seat, her face drained of color. Kelvin's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Thomas took a step forward, then another. Each step was measured, controlled, devastating. I told you all once, Thomas said calmly, his voice steady, that this company runs on integrity. He stopped at the head of the table, standing just behind Felicia. Apparently, he continued, some of you believed integrity died with me. No one spoke. Thomas turned his gaze to Kelvin. You moved money that wasn't yours, he said. Not because you needed it, but because you thought you could. Kelvin's voice cracked. Thomas, I can explain. Thomas looked at Felicia. And you, he said quietly, you turned grief into opportunity. Felicia swallowed. You faked your death. Yes, Thomas replied. And you failed the test. He gestured to Daniel, who continued the presentation without missing a beat. Let's finish, Thomas said. The screen displayed legal notices, internal triggers, automatic reversals, freezes. With immediate effect, Daniel read all unauthorized transactions are nullified. Full audits will commence. Relevant parties will cooperate with authorities. Kelvin stood abruptly. You can't do this. Thomas met his eyes. I already have. Security entered the room, calm, professional. Felicia's voice trembled with fury. You humiliated us. Thomas leaned closer to her, his voice low. No, you revealed yourselves. As Kelvin was escorted out, panic finally broke through his bravado. This isn't over, he shouted. Thomas didn't respond. When the room had settled into stunned silence, Thomas addressed the board. This meeting was never about revenge, he said. It was about truth. He paused. And truth, he added, has consequences. The board members nodded stiffly, some avoiding his gaze, others visibly relieved. Thomas turned away, signaling the end of the meeting. Outside, sunlight spilled through the corridor windows. Thomas stopped walking. For the first time since stepping into the room, his composure faltered just slightly. Because now came the harder part. Across the city, Sarah Owusu sat at her desk reviewing invoices, unaware that a storm she had never asked for was finally breaking. Her phone buzzed, an unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. Sarah Daniels' voice said gently, There's someone who would like to see you. Her heart skipped. Who? There was a pause. Someone you've already said goodbye to. Sarah's breath caught. Her fingers tightened around the phone. What do you mean? She whispered. Outside the office window, the city moved on cars, honking people rushing life loud and ordinary. Inside Sarah, everything went still. Sarah Owusu did not remember standing up from her chair. One moment she was holding the phone, listening to Daniel's words echo in her ear. The next, she was on her feet, her heart pounding so violently it felt like it might tear through her chest. Someone I already said goodbye to, she whispered again, her voice barely steady. Yes, Daniel replied. If you're willing, he would like to see you today. Sarah's fingers trembled. Is this some kind of mistake? There was a softness in Daniel's pause. No. The call ended gently, but the silence that followed was deafening. Her co-workers noticed her pale face. "Sarah, are you all right?" Mrs. Dyke asked, concern etched into her brow. Sarah forced a nod. I need to step out for a moment." She barely remembered gathering her things. She walked out of the building as if in a trance, the sun too bright, the world too loud. Her mind raced through impossible explanations, a relative, a coincidence, a misunderstanding. But her heart whispered one terrifying thought: alive. The drive felt endless. When the car finally stopped, Sarah found herself outside a quiet compound she had never seen before. No grandeur, no signs of wealth, just calm. Daniel met her at the gate. "You don't have to go in," he said gently. "You can leave at any time." Sarah swallowed. "If I don't, I'll never forgive myself." They walked inside. The room was simple: a couch, a table, sunlight filtering through sheer curtains, and there, standing near the window, was Thomas Balogun, alive, breathing, real. Sarah's legs gave out. She would have fallen if Daniel hadn't stepped forward instinctively, but Thomas moved faster. He caught her. "Sarah," he said softly. The sound of his voice broke something inside her. She pulled away suddenly, stumbling back as if burned. Her eyes widened, her chest heaving. "No," she whispered. "No, I buried you." Tears streamed down her face, uncontrolled, angry, confused. "I cried for you," she said, her voice rising. "I cried at your grave." Thomas's eyes glistened. "I know, that was all it took." The tears turned sharp, her grief twisting into fury. "You watched me," she said, realization crashing over her. "You watched me cry." Thomas nodded slowly. "Yes." Her hands shook as she clenched them into fists. "Do you have any idea what that did to me?" "I do," he said quietly, "and I will carry it for the rest of my life." Sarah laughed once, a broken, disbelieving sound. "You let them throw me out. You let them call me a thief. I didn't let them." Thomas replied, a pain evident now. "I stopped it as soon as I could without destroying the plan." "What plan?" she demanded. "Testing people, playing dead." Her voice cracked. "You tested me too." Thomas took a careful step forward. "No, I never tested you." She shook her head. "Then what was I? Collateral damage." The words hung heavy between them. Thomas closed his eyes briefly. "You were the proof I didn't know I was looking for." "That doesn't make it better," Sarah whispered. "I know." Silence settled. Finally, Sarah spoke again, quieter now, wounded but honest. "Everything I said at that grave, did it mean nothing to you?" Thomas looked at her fully, then no defenses left. It meant everything he said. It changed everything. He told her the truth, not all at once but carefully, about the accident, the plan, the need to expose greed, the way her tears had undone him. "I built systems to catch criminals," he said, "but I never built one to protect the innocent." Sarah listened without interrupting, tears still falling silently, and now she asked finally, "Now I want to make it right." Thomas said, "Not with money, not with power, with truth." She looked at him. Really looked at him for the first time since the shock had settled. "You hurt me," she said simply. "Yes, but you also believed me when no one else did." "Yes." Her voice dropped. "I don't know what to do with that." Thomas nodded. "I don't expect you to." He took a step back, giving her space. "I won't ask you to forgive me," he continued, "and I won't ask you to stay. All I want is to tell the truth publicly." Sarah frowned slightly. "Why?" "Because they didn't just lie about money," Thomas said. "They lied about you." He met her eyes steadily. "And I want the world to hear your name spoken with respect." Later that day, the press gathered in disbelief. Cameras flashed as Thomas Balogun stepped forward, alive, composed, undeniable. "I am aware the world believes I died," he began calmly. "That belief was intentional." Gasps rippled through the crowd. "But what matters more than my survival," he continued, "is what was revealed in my absence." He spoke of betrayal, of greed, of systems abused. Then unexpectedly he said her name, Sarah Owusu. Sarah watched from a private room, her heart racing. "She was accused of theft," Thomas said firmly. "That accusation was false." Murmurs spread. She lost her job, her dignity, her safety, for a lie. His voice hardened. "And she is not the only one." He ended the conference not with anger, but accountability. As the cameras shut off, Thomas exhaled slowly. Back in the quiet room, Sarah sat alone. She didn't feel victorious. She felt exposed. Thomas entered softly. "I've said what needed to be said," she nodded. "I didn't do it for redemption," he added. "I did it because it was owed." Sarah stood slowly. "I don't hate you," she said, "but I can't trust you yet." Thomas nodded. "That's fair." She hesitated at the door, then turned back. "One thing," she said. "At the grave." "I meant every word." Thomas's chest tightened. "So did I," he replied. She left without another word. And for the first time since returning to life, Thomas Balogun understood that some debts could not be paid quickly, only honestly. The days after the press conference moved differently for Sarah Owusu. Not faster, not slower, just heavier. Her name was suddenly everywhere, on screens, in articles, in conversations she passed on the street. People spoke it carefully now, with sympathy, with outrage, with curiosity. The same world that had ignored her pain was now eager to understand it. Sarah hated that part. She returned to work the morning after the announcement, hoping routine would anchor her. But the office felt altered. Colleagues glanced at her with new awareness. Some smiled too kindly. Others avoided her eyes. Mrs. Dyke called her into the office. "You didn't tell us," she said gently. Sarah kept her gaze steady. "I didn't know how." Mrs. Dyke nodded. "You don't owe anyone explanations. Just know you're respected here. That hasn't changed." Sarah exhaled slowly, grateful. But inside, something remained unsettled. She had seen Thomas again, heard his apology, witnessed him restore her name publicly. And still, her heart refused to rest. Because truth does not erase trauma. It only gives it language. That evening, Sarah returned to the safe house, exhaustion clinging to her bones. She expected quiet. Instead, Aisha met her at the door with a hesitant smile. "There's someone here to see you," Aisha said. Sarah's stomach tightened. "Who?" "He asked to speak to you privately," Aisha replied. "You can say no." Sarah closed her eyes briefly. She already knew. Thomas Balogun stood in the small sitting room, not in a suit, not surrounded by security. Just a man in a plain shirt, hands clasped in front of him like someone waiting for judgment. He did not move when she entered. "I won't stay long," he said immediately. "And if you want me to leave, I will." Sarah crossed her arms, not defensively, but to hold herself together. "You've already said what you needed to say," she replied. "Yes," Thomas said, publicly. She raised an eyebrow. "And this is personal," he answered, "and optional." Silence stretched. Sarah sat across from him, leaving distance between them. "You've given me my name back," she said. "You didn't have to do that." "I did," Thomas replied, "because I took something from you first." She looked away. Every night since that cemetery, Thomas continued quietly, "I've asked myself why your tears mattered so much." Sarah's jaw tightened. Was it guilt, he asked? Was it loneliness? Or was it because for the first time in my life someone loved me without knowing who I was? She met his eyes, then surprised. "I didn't love your money," she said firmly. "I didn't even love your power. I know. I loved that you were kind when no one forced you to be." She continued, "That you noticed people who were invisible." Her voice softened. "And that's why this hurts. Because the man I believed you were wouldn't have let that happen to me." Thomas nodded slowly, absorbing every word. "You're right," he said. "The man you believed in failed you." He leaned forward slightly, not reaching for her. "I can't undo that, but I can choose who I am next." Sarah studied him for a long moment. "What do you want from me?" she asked. Thomas answered without hesitation, "Nothing." She frowned. "That's not true." He held her gaze. "I want the chance to earn back your trust," slowly, without expectation. Her lips pressed together. "And if I can't," she asked, "then I'll respect that," he replied, "and still be grateful you existed in my life at all." The honesty disarmed her more than any apology could have. "I'm tired," Sarah said quietly. "Tired of being strong. Tired of being tested. I won't test you again." Thomas said, "I promise." She stood, signaling the end of the conversation. "I don't know where this goes," she said, "but if you want to be in my life, you'll have to meet me where I am." Thomas stood as well. "Wherever that is," he said, "I'll meet you there." After he left, Sarah sat alone in the quiet room, staring at the space he had occupied. For the first time, she didn't feel angry. She felt cautious, which for her was progress. Over the following weeks, Thomas kept his distance but not his word. He didn't send gifts, didn't call unexpectedly, didn't appear uninvited. Instead, small things changed around her. The logistics firm where Sarah worked received new contracts, fair ones, transparent ones, without pressure. Her supervisors noticed growth opportunities opening naturally. Training programs appeared. A promotion path was outlined, not for her alone, but for everyone. Sarah noticed. She also noticed that the safe house quietly transitioned into long-term housing assistance. Not labeled, not announced, just done. One afternoon, Daniel met her for coffee. "He's trying," Daniel said, carefully. "I see that," Sarah replied. "And how do you feel?" She stirred her cup slowly, like someone learning how to breathe after almost drowning. Daniel smiled gently. "That takes time." Across the city, Felicia Balogun sat alone in her apartment, the silence pressing in. Legal proceedings had begun, assets frozen, reputation fractured. For the first time, she felt what Sarah had felt: powerless. And somewhere quietly, justice unfolded without spectacle. One evening, weeks later, Sarah stood at the cemetery again, not to cry, to close a chapter. Thomas did not follow her. He waited by the gate far enough to give her space. Sarah knelt briefly, placed a single flower on the grave, and stood. When she turned, Thomas was there, but he didn't speak. She walked toward him slowly. "I needed to say goodbye to who I thought you were," she said. "And hello?" he asked gently. She considered him. "To who you might become," she answered. They walked out of the cemetery side by side, not touching, not promising, but no longer divided by lies. For the first time since that rainy night, Sarah felt something unexpected. Not certainty, but possibility. The morning Sarah Owusu moved into her new apartment, she stood at the doorway for a long time without stepping inside. The keys felt strange in her hand, light, cold, real. This place was not a gift, not a reward, not compensation. It was a lease in her name, paid for by her own earnings, supported quietly by a housing program she had qualified for without favoritism or pressure. Everything was documented. Everything was clean. That mattered to her. She walked through the room slowly. The apartment was small but bright, with wide windows that let the city in. The walls were bare. The air smelled faintly of fresh paint and something new. For the first time in her adult life, Sarah closed a door and knew no one could open it without her permission. She sat on the floor and cried, not loudly, not from pain, but from relief so deep it frightened her. Across the city, Thomas Balogun stood in his office watching the Lagos skyline through glass that reflected his own face back at him. The empire was intact again, but changed. The boardroom no longer echoed with fear. Audits were ongoing. Systems were being rebuilt. People who had abused power were gone. And yet Thomas felt less in control than ever before, because the one thing he could not command, trust, stood just out of reach. He had kept his promise to Sarah. Distance, patience, no pressure, but patience did not quiet longing. He picked up his phone, hesitated, then set it down again. Later that evening, Sarah received a message from Daniel. He's hosting a small dinner. No press, no agenda, just people who were hurt and those trying to do better. You're invited. No obligation. Sarah stared at the screen for a long time. She didn't owe Thomas anything, but she owed herself the right to choose. She replied with one word. Okay. The dinner was held at a modest restaurant overlooking the lagoon. No security detail, no cameras, just warm lights, quiet music, and simple food. When Sarah arrived, Thomas stood as she approached, not out of habit but respect. "Thank you for coming," he said. She nodded. "Thank you for asking," without insisting. They sat across from each other. Around them were people Sarah didn't recognize, former employees who had been wrongfully dismissed, a supplier whose contract had been manipulated, a junior manager who had spoken up and paid the price. Thomas listened more than he spoke. He apologized without defending himself. He acknowledged harm without minimizing it. He didn't ask for forgiveness. Sarah watched carefully. This wasn't a performance. This was accountability. After dinner, as the group slowly dispersed, Sarah and Thomas remained seated. "You didn't have to include me in this," Sarah said. "I did," Thomas replied, "because your pain was part of the truth that woke me up." She studied him. "You're changing." "I'm trying," he answered. "There's a difference." She smiled faintly. That night, Thomas walked her to her car, but did not open the door for her. Not because he lacked manners, because he knew she didn't need saving. "Good night, Sarah," he said. "Good night, Thomas." As she drove away, Sarah felt something unfamiliar settle into her chest, trust not whole, not healed, but forming, slowly. Over the next months, their lives began to intersect gently. They met for coffee in public places, talked about books, not wounds, laughed about ordinary things. Thomas never brought up the grave unless she did. Sarah never flinched when he said her name. One afternoon, Sarah visited the Balogun Foundation for the first time, not as a subject of charity, but as a consultant. She walked through the building with confidence, her head high. "This program focuses on domestic workers," she said to the team. "But dignity isn't training, it's protection." Thomas watched from the back of the room. She wasn't speaking for him, she was speaking from herself. That night he told her the truth he had been holding back. "I don't want to define you by what you suffered," he said. "But I can't pretend I don't care." Sarah looked at him steadily. "Caring isn't the problem," she said. "Control is." "I won't try to control you," Thomas replied, "even if it means losing you." The words settled between them. Weeks later, on a quiet Sunday morning, Sarah invited Thomas into her apartment for the first time. She cooked. He washed dishes. They argued lightly over music. At one point, she caught him standing in her living room, looking around with quiet wonder. What she asked. He shook his head. "I never imagined you like this." "Like what, free?" he said. Sarah's throat tightened. That night, as rain began to fall against her windows, Sarah spoke the words she had been holding for months. "I don't forgive easily," she said. "But I don't want to live closed either." Thomas listened. "I'm still afraid," she admitted. "But I don't want fear to decide everything." He took a slow breath. "I love you," he said, not as a demand, not as a plea, not because you're strong, not because you're kind, but because you're you. Sarah didn't answer immediately. She stood, walked to the window, watched the rain trace lines of silver down the glass. Then she turned back to him. "I loved you once," she said softly, "without safety, without truth." She stepped closer. "If I love you again," she continued, "it will be with my eyes open." Thomas nodded. "That's all I ask." She reached for his hand, not because she needed it, but because she chose it. Outside, the city breathed. And inside that small apartment, two lives, once divided by silence, power, and pain, stood finally on equal ground. The day Sarah Owusu returned to the cemetery, the sky was clear. No rain, no thunder, no dramatic signs. Just sunlight moving gently across the rows of stone, warming the earth that had once held her tears. She walked slowly between the graves, carrying a single white lily. Not because it was expensive, not because it was symbolic, but because it was simple and real. Thomas followed several steps behind her. He had asked if she wanted to go alone. She had shaken her head. "Not alone," she said, "just not in front." So he walked behind her, now silent, respectful, present without intrusion. They stopped in front of the grave that once carried his name. The stone was still there. Thomas Balogun, beloved son, leader, legacy. Sarah knelt, resting the lily gently at the base. For a long moment she said nothing. Thomas waited. "I used to think this place held you," Sarah said finally, her voice calm, "that if I cried hard enough, you might hear me." She exhaled slowly. "But it wasn't you I buried here." Thomas felt his chest tighten. "It was my fear," she continued. "My belief that kindness doesn't survive power. That people like me don't get seen unless we're broken." She stood. "And today I'm letting that go." Thomas stepped forward, then not to interrupt but to stand beside her. "I don't want this grave to remind me of pain anymore," Sarah said. "I want it to remind me of truth." She turned to him. "You died here," she said gently, "and something better lived." Thomas swallowed. "I wish I could erase what you went through," he said quietly. "I don't," Sarah replied, "because it taught me something." She met his eyes. "That dignity isn't given by the powerful, it's claimed by the brave." They stood there together, the silence between them no longer heavy but whole. Later that afternoon, Sarah returned to her apartment alone. She opened the windows, letting the city in, the laughter, the traffic, the distant music. She moved through her space with ease, touching the bookshelf, the table, the chair by the window. This life was hers. Not borrowed, not defended, earned. Her phone buzzed, a message from Naomi. "I saw you on the news again. You look different." "Happier," Sarah smiled and typed back. "I am. I finally feel like myself." That evening, Thomas hosted one final meeting at Balogun Holdings, not with lawyers, not with executives, but with people, employees from every level, contractors, cleaners, drivers, assistants. He stood at the front of the room, not elevated, not framed by symbols of power. "I once believed leadership meant control," he said. "Now I understand it means responsibility." He paused. "I failed that responsibility when I allowed an experiment to harm an innocent person." A murmur moved through the room. "I won't repeat that mistake." He announced permanent reforms, worker protections, anonymous reporting systems, legal aid support, housing partnerships. But what stayed with people wasn't the policy, it was the humility. After the meeting, Thomas didn't retreat to his office. He walked out into the city. Later that night, he stood outside Sarah's building, looking up at the light in her window. He didn't call. He didn't knock. He simply stood there, breathing in the quiet truth that love, real love, waits for consent. Upstairs, Sarah turned off her lamp and lay in bed, her thoughts calm. She wasn't afraid of the future anymore, because she knew she could walk away if she needed to, and choosing to stay was no longer survival, it was strength. Weeks passed, life settled, not into perfection but into honesty. Sarah continued her work, rising steadily. She mentored others who reminded her of herself, quiet, capable, overlooked. Thomas worked beside her, not above her. They argued sometimes, laughed often, chose each other daily. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the city softened, Thomas turned to Sarah on her balcony. "I don't want to build a future that erases the past," he said. "I want one that honors it." Sarah considered him. "Then we build it slowly," she replied, "and we don't hide the scars." He nodded. That night they stood together, watching the city lights come alive. No secrets, no tests, no graves between them. Only two people, once divided by power and silence, now bound by choice. And somewhere beneath the noise of the city, a quiet truth held steady, that kindness, when seen and protected, has the power to resurrect more than the dead. It can resurrect dignity, hope, and love. Life does not always reward kindness immediately. Sometimes it tests it harshly, unfairly, without explanation. But this story reminds us of something deeper. That character is revealed when power believes itself unseen and dignity survives even when stripped of everything else. Sarah Owusu had nothing, but she kept her truth. Thomas Balogun had everything but had to lose it to learn what mattered. Their journey teaches us that real love is not proven by grand gestures, but by accountability, patience, and the courage to change. So let us ask ourselves, when no one is watching, who are we kind to? And when we have power, do we protect the vulnerable or test them? If this story touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever been unseen and still chosen goodness? And if you believe stories like this matter, stories of hope, justice, and human worth, don't forget to subscribe, because kindness deserves to be remembered.